everyone. Welcome to the Janashakti Network. Today we have with us Professor Roland Boer. He's a professor at School of Philosophy in Renmin University, and recently, a few years back, he has also written a monograph on socialism with Chinese characteristics, a guide to foreigners. I think, he's researching in history of Marxist philosophy in China, and we also have with us Professor Gao Jian. He's a professor at Shanghai International Studies University. So, welcome to both of you
Thank
Thank
you.
to
you
the
very much.
Janashakti Network podcast. So I think I think I need not talk much about the accomplishments that China has uh, done in the last 3 decades. Today, China is in terms of purchasing power parity. China is the topmost economy, and that does not encompass all the accomplishments of China. China has eliminated absolute poverty. It has elevated more than any other global South country. It has elevated the living standards of its people. And if you actually look at numbers, when we say in the last 10 to 20, in the last 2 decades, the global South has been pushed forefront in the global political arena, and one can frankly say it is majorly due to China. So if we look at the data, the global data, for example, in the year 2000, the global North, which is the Western European countries and the North America, they have contributed to 72% of global GDP, whereas China's share was 5.2% of the global GDP. And down 20 years down the line, the share of the global north has fallen to 43%, whereas China's has risen from 5.2 to 28%. So now these simple numbers actually tell us a lot about the global power shift and the rise of China and the global south. If we take out China and look at rest of the global south, for example, I am sitting in India. If you look at India, so India's share in that time period has increased only from 1.3% to 2.9% of the global GDP. Now, so when we say the rise of global south, basically we are talking mainly of the rise of China. China has impacted the equations between global south and global north in a ways rest of the global south probably have not. The increasing economic power of China and relative decline in the power of the global north has given provided rest of the global south a space for development, a space a little away from the oppression and the coercion of global north. uh, uh, the results of which we have been seeing in the last decade. So China's rise is has been is has can I can say that it's synonymous with the rise of global South in the last 2 decades. If you look at manufacturing sector, the contrast is even more. So China today is the industrial center of the whole world. Now, how this has happened in the last 3 decades can be said the and we can we say that it's the era of neoliberalism in the global south. Countries like India, Brazil, everybody have opened up, and not always with good results. Many of the global south countries still remain the exporters of raw material. And some of the global south countries like India, Bangladesh, and in Asia still export goods with highly labor intensive goods with very little technology. But China has, in this using the same in the same global scenario, in the same global capitalistic scenario, China has went on a different path. It has made use of the global supply chain networks and the global capitalistic logic. It has made that subservient to China's socialistic path. So I would like you to comment on that process. So what are the fundamental principles, that anchored fundamental Marxist principles that anchored this China's path, and what are the principles on which China has been flexible so that it could embark on this path?
Would you like me to begin or
Yes,
Professor
yes.
Galjian?
Yes, Professor Bauer, if you may, please.
Perhaps it's a huge topic, but maybe I'll begin with 3 points. One is a more general or theoretical point, and two are actually very practical and recent experiences of mine. The first one is the focus on GDP, gross domestic product. I think we can probably say that, say, 20 years ago, there was a heavy emphasis on this in China. But there's been a lot of research done and policy proposals that, in considering these sorts of questions, we actually need to consider a wider range of aspects such as education, medicine, welfare, aged care, and so on and so forth. And so it's been proposed to use what's called a gross domestic welfare product. And that's a more accurate measure of actually how people, the common people, are actually benefiting from the process. So that's a more general theoretical point. But I want to give two very practical experiences. The first one is that in May, I paid a visit, a fairly intensive visit. I was invited by a resident party secretary in an area of northern Fujian province called Songxi County, and the village there is called Dabu Village. Now, Songxi County was one of the 832 poor counties identified about a decade ago, which needed particular measures for focusing on lifting the county out of absolute poverty. And there were quite a large number of families that were earning below 3,000 RMB or yuan per year. And so their policies developed over time. And Songxi County was finally, after very careful inspection, called literally the two no worries and the three assurances. No worries about food and clothing, and assurances of compulsory education, basic medicine, and so on, was declared free of absolute poverty in November of 2019. However, we must remember, and the reason I visited because I'm very interested in what's now known as rural revitalization, because the absolute poverty threshold is only a beginning, and we can still speak of relative poverty in the sense that there are poorer areas and also more wealthy areas. And so I was very interested in what is happening in such a place that only very recently was able to throw off absolute poverty for the purpose of rural revitalization. Now, we can talk about that a bit later on. The second example, I'll try and keep this brief. Last year in November, when I was based in Shanghai, I visited a former doctoral student in Hangzhou, and she works in a non-public enterprise called Hailiang. Now, Hailiang is a non-public enterprise, but it has about 3,000 party members and branches and committees. Now, there's two main, in the principles of this enterprise, and the founder of it is a Buddhist, so he's not a party member. There's two main features of the enterprise. The first of all is the economic bottom line. The enterprise focuses on components for a lot of industry, education, and organic rural produce. The first one is the economic bottom line. Obviously, the enterprise has to stay economically viable. But the second, and it was emphasized to me very much by my former doctoral student, this is now the most important one, is social responsibility. So beyond the economic bottom line at the margin, the resources of the enterprise go into areas such as rural education, rural revitalization, providing special needs education, and so on and so forth. And I think that's a very interesting indicator of the emphasis, the practical emphasis on social responsibility, or on making sure that even, and especially non-public enterprises are focused on benefits of the public, things for the public good. I'll leave it there. That's I spoke a bit too long. I'll try and keep it brief in future.
Thank you. I just make a brief response. Yes, I agree with the host. and China. Oh, can you hear me clearly? Yes, okay. Yeah, and China has achieved a great success in the past decades, especially our, let's say, in the past more than 40 years of social reform. And before 1949, China actually, according to the history, China fall behind on the way to modernization from the world's view. And even in the 1970s, and in comparison with the developed world, developed countries in the world, China was at that time still very, very, falling behind the nation, and in many by many standards. And however, with I think it was in 1978, after the very important convention of CPC, and China have decided to put the economic development at the core, and we just embarked on the social reform course in the past more than 4 decades. And yes, and China has made a miraculous achievement, and economically, socially, and politically. And we have established a systematic discourse on Chinese modernization. And and at the same time, what I'm going to say is that, especially if we observe the past decades of what happened in the world, we would use the unprecedented change of century to describe what happened in the past 10 years. Especially in the new century, we can see that, generally speaking, for the world, we can see that the Western power, to a certain degree, as the host described, is comparatively declining, whilst the global South powers, we say the new rising economies, new rising markets, economies, and the global South countries, we actually have been growingly important in the decision making of the world's affairs. And we actually, all together, all the countries from the global South, and especially from the newly rising markets, we've contributed more than 70% for the world's economic development. And we've occupied more than 40% of the whole world's GDP. So it indicates that the world is witnessing a tremendously
Mm,
transcendental, milestone change for the world's whole map. So we are really witnessing a change in time, a tremendously dramatic change in time. However, what I'm going to emphasize is that ever since the 17, I mean, yeah, the seven, the 18th National Convention of CPC, and we say that Chinese socialism has been stepping into the new area, which is very important.
mm,
How to interpret the word new area? This is a very philosophical while very comprehensive definition. So, according to the document, the paper released from the CPC, actually, the new mission for Chinese government now is that we must respond to the new situation in China, in response to the more Chinese people's dream of a better and more comprehensively well balanced life, and try to overcome some kind of imbalance in economic development, between spiritual life and the materialistic life, between the rural area and the urban area, and how to make the balance between economic development and the protection of their, let's say, ecology. So these are very, very important questions we must answer. So, yes, and the Chinese government take it as a huge task and a mission to respond to the new challenges in now and in the future. So, generally speaking, what we are going to do now and in the future is to advance and go on try to create a let's say a advanced version of Chinese modernization. And yes, with pride, I would like to say this is a trial on some new pattern of culture on the human beings' road to modernization. And we would like to say it will definitely invest into the world modernization with some new perspectives, which is derived from the Chinese culture as well as from some new sorts of wisdom, which is quite different from the Western cultures. So I stop here.
Could I add three small statistics here that I think are very highlighting or highlight what my good friend Gao Jian has just said? The first one is what is the West or Western countries? Depending on how you count them, there's probably 18, maybe 20, some would count more. But of the global population, they're only about 11 or 12%. So, in some respects, Western dominance for the last few hundred years has been a strange historical anomaly. The vast majority of the world, obviously, is outside Western countries. Two other statistics, from what I understand, in 1949, life expectancy in China was between 33 and 35, and the first half of the 30s. The life expectancy now is over 78 and rising, and is now higher than the United States, where life expectancy is falling. And I'm also told that in 1949, teenagers compared to teenagers today are 7 to 8 centimeters taller than they were in 1949. And this has obviously got to do with questions of nutrition, quality of life, and medical care. And I think those sorts of statistics tell a rather large story.
Professor Bauer, you are there?
Yes, I'm back.
Yes.
Just,
Okay.
I know you're recording. Just a moment. I'm using data, and my phone is in the other room. So I'll just go and bring my phone next to my computer, so it's a bit more stable. Just a moment.
Yes.
Okay. I would like to use the time slot, and yes, and I quite appreciate all the statistics Professor Bourne has provided. This is very sharp comparative studies, and quite interesting. Yeah, Professor, please go on.
Oh, I was just going to give a very practical example. So, for some time now, I've been buying Huawei phones. It's a Huawei phone. And the Huawei 70 Pro Plus is regarded as the best smartphone in the world. Of course, you can only buy the Mate in mainland China. But to give you an example, so it's a 5G phone where when I'm in China. In rural areas, I still go to 4G, but it's standard 5G. Australia basically has renamed its 4G 5G and claims it's 5G, but it's actually easier and faster to use data on your phone for internet connection than to get Wi-Fi in your home. So in Australia, I use phone data because the Wi-Fi quality here is so bad, even though it's just 4G in Australia. Just little contrasts. And the trains we have here are equivalent to what in China are called the green skin trains. These are the old style trains of 15, 20, 25, 30 years ago. That's it. That's all we have in Australia for a so-called developed country. Anyway, look, I like being in Australia. Don't get me wrong.
but may I just point out, and we've talked materialistic perspective a lot, but I just want to point out, I don't quite you know be willing to talk very much about materialistic perspective,
Mm.
because in my understanding, Chinese modernization, particularly in the new area, yes, it must be based on the materialistic development, economic development. However, what I'm going to emphasize is to elaborate on the new area of Chinese socialism or Chinese modernization. We must focus on the balanced society
That's right.
to approach Chinese modernization from
Mm,
a more comprehensive perspective. So, this is a very, very new challenge we are facing now because in Chinese conception of an ideal society, the society must be offered, the well balanced enjoyment materialistically and spiritually.
mm,
So, the culture value of Chinese culture interpretation of the value of life, if you look at the history and it's the culture, you will find that actually Chinese tradition now, generally, yes, we think highly of the importance of materialistic perspective. However, we don't just, weigh a lot on that because we want a balanced life. We want a spiritually free life. That is Chinese dream.
mm,
Yes.
Uh, So, Professor, to both of you, uh, if would it be right to say that the period of until 79, the Mao Zedong's period, if we can call that, laid foundations for the development of productive forces within China, whereas the later period, from starting from Deng Xiaoping, has the pace of development of productive forces picked up, and probably inequalities and certain anomalies also have seeped in, whereas the current period is going to be a recalibration period. And so can you comment on that? What kind of recalibration is happening, if it is happening?
mm. Well, maybe, yeah, okay. I'll make a couple of comments. If we look from my understanding, the broader historical perspective, what we saw in China after 1949, up until the late 1970s, was a highly centralized planned economy and a high level of collectivization. And historically, on countries setting out on the socialist road, this has been necessary. And in China's case, it was dealing with the relics of feudal relics and comprador capitalism and bureaucratism and so on. And it did produce some significant economic gains over the time. But over a while, and here it's a philosophical but also very concrete distinction, relationship between the forces of production and the relations of production. Forces of production are all those elements that enable production to move forward. Relations of production are human relations involved in production, very roughly. Over time, more and more contradictions were arising, and it was found that the relations of production were holding back the forces of production. There were more problems and contradictions, even with all the achievements. And so the reform and opening up was a process of further liberating productive forces by recalibrating or revising the relations of production. And until we can speak of 40 or so years until the new era when there's a deepening of reform, that's sort of a fairly abstract and broad framework. I think I'd like to just, as a background to that, there was already discovered in the Soviet Union that the being on the socialist road, I think we need to be very clear about that. It's on the socialist road, is full of contradictions, multiple contradictions, which constantly need to be dealt with. Without the contradictions, it would not move forward, but the contradictions always need to be tackled, analysed, and solved in that process of moving forward. If we're speaking economically here, but I would also very much like to support Professor Gao Jian's points that it's not just about material life, material well-being. It's important, but it's also culturally, socially, or in the Chinese term, spiritual, but it's not a religious sense. It is a fulfilled life in many respects, and that is really a noticeable development in the new era since the 18th Congress in 2012. I notice it especially with young people.
Oh, I agree with Professor Bowen. And let me just clarify. and talking about the whole process of Chinese modernization. Actually, this is a really a long course, and we face different missions and tasks at different stages. And let's say in the Chairman Mao, we say the early socialism period after 1949. Actually, China at that time was largely speaking an agriculturally oriented society, although we found a modern China. However, and so for the Chairman Mao's generation, the mission is, and economically speaking, is to make up the foundation,
Mm,
industrial foundation for the Chinese future. So actually, we would give thanks to the Soviet Union because they did provide enormous helps to the foundation of Chinese industry in roughly speaking, 1950s and at that time. And then, and we know that CPC in that very typical time, say, cultural revolution, and in we made some mistakes, and it will be kind of cultural catastrophe. And however, ever since 1979, the Chinese central government realized the enormous, the universal poverty is not socialism, and we must respond to people's need of economic development, their need for a better life, materialistic speaking. So, the opening up policy just to ensure that our a lot of changes economically and socially and even culturally to some degree. And however, after more than 40 years of a high-speed development, China, as a host has described, established itself as the second largest economy. And however, we have to point out we've made tremendous progress. However, we do consequentially witness some social problems that had occurred in the society, and we must face and fix it. So, in the new area, again, I'm going to emphasize, and for the advanced stage of Chinese modernization, it will be a very comprehensive social problem to face, and how to lead a balanced social life, and
mm,
how to make an advanced interpretation of what is socialism, what is Chinese socialism, what is Chinese modernization, and how to make a new pattern of modernization for China as well as for the world. These questions must be answered with the Chinese practice in the future. And what I'm going to emphasize is that uh, as we've seen simultaneously in the past 40 years and until now. And what happened in the world is that we've seen that the successful story of the Western culture have witnessed, encountered some very, very tremendous social problems. Now we've seen and we've been watching now. We've seen so many turmoils in American society, and we've seen some economic stagnation in the European countries now. We've seen the double standard as a political memo widely spread in a lot of social respects in the Western societies. So the social contradictions are very, very extreme, partisan extremity, and also we see the fragmentation of society.
mm,
these questions, these questions are a very, very good, it's a very conspicuous reflection of some very, very in-depth social problems in the Western modernization. So, for the world, for the common benefits of the world, for the common future of the world, I think we must figure out how to create a new pattern of modernization, a common modernization for the world. So this is a very important. I think on this point, Chinese culture and as a global south countries, the new rising market countries, we have the obligation to make our new contribution to that. Yeah.
Perhaps I can add an example from some of the students that I've been teaching more recently. I've begun teaching what I believe is the first all English language master's level course on Marxist philosophy in China. It's an overview of 100 years since Chuchuabai in 1923 until the present. But my students come from India, Pakistan, Nepal, and Germany. So it's a very interesting mix of students. And it's actually, now some students, a student from Nepal, for example, is conversant with some aspects of, let's say, Marxist theory, but he tended to see it as political ideology. So his learning process was to find that it's also a philosophical approach. But also in other areas, especially students from African countries, they're very, very interested in what is Chinese modernization or what is Chinese style modernization. And it's not so that they can copy the model in China. That's not how they see it. They can't just copy it because of China's own history, its 5,000 years of civilization, its cultural emphases, but it's more how can you develop a model or a style of modernization that is suited to your own country's history, culture, and tradition? What will work? And this is economic modernization, it's political modernization, it's social modernization, and so on. That's what interests, and I notice this especially from students from African countries, but also from other parts of the global south, the world majority, really. That's the and the achievements are obvious, and this is what draws people's attention. Because especially in former colonized countries, in Africa, for example, by France and the UK, etc., they had imposed on them a kind of Western, post-colonial model, which they increasingly found has not worked and has kept them in a very poor and undeveloped state.
Uh, I just have a small question there. So, Professor, you said that when global South countries, African and other African Asian countries, the erstwhile colonized countries, when they look to China, they have to look at Chinese experience, but have to look at their own socio-economic, historical, political realities. Uh, but one big thing about China is it has a socialist foundation, and it's a lot of common resources, and it had a history of revolution. How much can that be adapted to by the third world countries? What are the elements, at least, that can be adapted? Particular elements.
Hmm. That's a very, very interesting question. How can you take these? Okay, well, let's start with a basic point, and then I'll let my good friend take over. Let's begin with a very simple question. How do we understand socialism? Okay. Now, there's a famous sentence in the manifesto of the Communist Party, to gloss it, basically, where Marx and Engels point out that the working class will seize by degrees the means of production from the bourgeoisie and in the hands of the state, and accelerate the productive forces as rapidly as possible. There's two parts to this sentence. The first one concerns the ownership of the means of production. The second one concerns what you can call liberating or developing productive forces. Now, if you ask someone who knows a little bit about Marxism in a Western country, what do you think socialism is? They will say, oh, it's the working class owning the means of production. Okay, but that's only half of the equation. That's only half. And it's very interesting that if you look at countries that have gone through a revolutionary process and set out on the socialist road, if you look at in Vietnam with the writings of Ho Chi Minh, as we know him, but also early on in China and elsewhere, there was as much an emphasis on liberating productive forces. Why? Because, and also actually in the Soviet Union, why? Because where a proletarian revolution was successful and a communist party was able to take power, inevitably the country has been in a very poor and fragmented state. So I think if we look at that aspect of it, and if we look at the many formerly colonized parts of the world, especially ones that remain in an undeveloped state or in a developing state, if we look at that basic principle, what is it about the local situation, a very concrete scientific assessment of the economic situation that needs to be done for that. And then on the material foundation, you also need to go, what is it about our cultural tradition? What do we emphasize? What do we see as important? What can be taken up in a new framework? What is it out of our history that is actually valuable that we shouldn't throw away? And start to develop a particular model or a particular approach in light of those factors. So there's some basic principles, but the way the model will develop will depend on each each part of the world.
I I before I touch on the definition of socialism, allow me to respond to Professor Bowen's comment on Chinese pattern or Chinese mode. I absolutely agree with the idea that there's no transfixed conception of Chinese mode or Chinese pattern. And no, no. Actually, this is quite popular with the Western culture. Say, well, modernization has a kind of standard, standard pattern. Previously, it was monopolized by Westernization, and particularly after the collapse of the previous Soviet Union, and Fukuyama in his book The End of History just point out Americanization is the common future of the world. So that is their interpretation of modernization in the code of Americanization as a kind of a uniformed pattern for every country's road to modernization. However, uh, what happened for them is just I still remember, let's say, 20 years ago, in the Department of Americans website, say, what is our response, our obligation and the responsibility is to copy, use the word, no, clone, is to clone our democracy to all over the world, to share with the world our freedom. That is their interpretation of modernization. But what happened is, it seems that domestically they refuse to share their own pattern of wisdom and freedom anymore. And so, very, very important thing for all the developing countries, for the future countries, on the road to modernization, one point I'm going to emphasize is we must treasure and treasure our tradition and culture, and we must have a full realization. Any success of the way to modernization must be based on our culture, our tradition, and with some, are kind of universally acknowledged principles. We must combine the acknowledged principles of modernization with our tradition and culture, so as to make out our own way, our own road to modernization. In this sense, I would like to say, if there were a Chinese pattern, that is, there is no Chinese pattern. Okay. And for socialism, the word socialism, well, my understanding, my first response is that I've sensed a lot of times that socialism has been regarded as a corrupted, politically corrupted world in a Western society. It was interpreted as a kind of source of corruption, as a kind of out of date as political ideology, as kind of failure, as kind of failed conception in social practice. And I can sense that when the Western media or the Western politician they want to demonize China or demonize some other countries, they would use they are socialist countries, they are communism countries. So this world has been kind of demonized as kind of failure nation or as a kind of evil nation even. This is quite ridiculous. So in the Western and socialism is derived from the European culture in the 18th century and thrived to some degree in the 19th century. However, as Gramsci pointed out, the early practice of socialism failed, particularly in the developed countries. It was in the Soviet Union who actually successfully made out a pattern of socialism with previous Soviet Union practice. And I want to say that we can easily sense um, for the French Revolution, for the Paris Community, for the Soviet Union, and for some Eastern European countries, their practice of socialism, we can see that there is a certain element of social culture and the tradition that is in response to the foundation of socialism in practice. However, uh, unfortunately, especially during the Second World War time and after that. And we can see, although some elements of socialism were inherited in the political practice, even in the developed countries like Britain, France. However, it will be take the form of democratic parties. This is, yes, to some degree, this is a part of the realization of some social welfare requirements, which is confirmed by socialism. However, I just want to say these are just European interpretation of socialism in the 19th century and in the 20th century. What is socialism? I think our socialism as a definition of political ideology must be invested with some new blood, with some new cultural practice. And socialism would die if not being re-injected with some new ideas from different cultural backgrounds. And we can see it is a fact, it is a mere sheer fact. Globally speaking, socialism is not in its high time. However, even in America, young people nowadays are growingly have a concern about socialism. And we can see, although the Western European countries, they demonize socialism as a political ideology. However, actually in their social daily practice, they come to realize maybe going back to socialism principle would be a alternative choice for their future. As for China, definitely, China will stick to the principle of socialism very firmly. And we will invest the socialism with Chinese characteristics. Again, and traditional and culturally speaking, in Chinese culture, we have some very important elements in response to socialism. And nationally speaking, what we are doing now, nationwide, is our adoption of socialism as a social practice in combination of our traditional cultural value. So I would like to say, yes, China will take the obligation and the responsibility to go on and rewrite what is socialism with Chinese characteristics. That is our mission.
Maybe if I can add a philosophical point here, and it's a very insightful, brief passage in Chairman Mao's speech from 1938 called On the New Stage. And he makes a very interesting distinction, and he'd been studying not long before, deeply studying Marxist philosophy, and was developing some major new steps in Marxist philosophy from the Soviet Union. But he makes a point there. He says there's no such thing as abstract Marxism. There's only concrete Marxism. And what does concrete Marxism mean? Concrete Marxism is taking Marxist theory and adapting it and integrating it with the concrete conditions in a particular country or particular place. Now, that principle is very, very interesting because you can actually say that already in the Soviet Union, through the practices there was a development of a concrete Marxism. And this is the universal about Marxism. Yes, you need the theory, you have the tradition built up from experience, but it's concrete Marxism. And from my perspective anyway, the distinct contribution in China is that it's been a century-long process of this concrete Marxism in two major respects. It's, first of all, in light of China's concrete realities. What are the concrete realities? And this changes over time. In the 1920s or 30s, the concrete realities were different from the 50s and 60s as they're different from today. So it's a constant process of development, and it's been a century long, longer than a century long project. But the second one that Professor Gao Jian has been emphasizing very much and has become explicit in the last 4 years is also the integration with the best of traditional culture, the long cultural tradition, the fuller life that people seek. And this is very, very, very important for understanding Marxism, concrete Marxism, and understanding how socialism develops and is constantly in a process through practice of gaining greater understanding of what socialism actually means as a concrete practice.
Very good point. Thank you. You brilliantly re-elaborate what I said, and a yes, and well, uh, I agree that I personally absolutely believe in socialism over the common prospects of the future for the humankind, and which has been actually clearly demonstrated by many means by the success of Chinese socialism with Chinese characteristics, and also equally demonstrated by some very important in-depth social contradictions and problems that occurred in the Western cultures. So, how to solve all these problems? I think capitalism can never uh, provide any solution to that. I can see none. Okay, so what is their future? Now, we must rethink the importance of socialism. But in what way we could practice socialism? Marx himself pointed very clearly that there's no transfixed, uniformed way road to modernization. And Engels, his very dear comrade, said Marxism is not a theory, it is just a methodology. It is just just to provide a perspective to look at the world. But how to realize your political dream? It is a problem of practice instead of theories.
That's
This
right.
is very, very important. Very important. And however, maybe now I have a guess is that for those countries who traditionally and culturally have very strong tradition and culture which is related to socialism principles would have the advantage to make full use of. So I would like to point out the cultural foundation is extremely, extremely important for the making out of socialism in the future.
Mm,
In this sense, in this sense, I want to point out India has an advantage to make full use of for the realization of socialism because by population, India is such a huge population, and India has a strong background of commonwealth. Let's don't never miss this opportunity with that. Yeah.
Yeah, India certainly has a lot to learn from Chinese experience, and I mean, I think every actor in Indian political spectrum actually feels that it's not just the left. So, Chinese have been an example. And coming back to what Professor Boer was saying, that application of Marxism in the concrete conditions of a particular society of historical history, uh, and then talking about socialism. So one aspect of Chinese application of Marxism and Chinese socialism with Chinese characteristics that we have seen in the last 30 years is the role of uh, private capital, a role of non-public sector within Chinese economy and Chinese society, which has been allowed to play out in a limited sense with land being still a common property, with huge amount of industry still in state's hands, but nonetheless private capital has been allowed a play, and it has generated contradictions. uh, Going forward, and not just going forward, what has been the uh, li- limits that that have been placed on private sector, and going forward, what is the idea of Chinese Communist Party, or application of Marxism in China? In how does it look at private sector? How does it look at non-public sector?
Right. Massive question after more than 50 minutes, a huge question. Um, Maybe I can put it this way. So, with the reform and opening up and the introduction of a market component, we need to understand the problem is a lot of people think a market economy equals a capitalist market economy. This is not the case at all. Historically, there have been market economies in ancient Persia, in ancient Greece and Rome, but they were quite different and they were not capitalist market economies. And it's only one form that has become capitalist. So there's a universal aspect called a market economy, but it takes on a very different shape depending upon the system in which it's in. And in a Chinese situation, it becomes a socialist market economy. And this is not getting rid of planning, it's planning and market finding a new way to operate together and actually improve planning and vice versa. So that's just a basic sort of theoretical point here. From my understanding, the way forward currently is that there is a significant transition underway in many respects. We've been talking about many of those aspects, and it's commonly translated as new quality productive forces. I prefer to translate it as qualitatively new productive forces. That's a philosophical point from one of the principles of dialectics, that you have quantitative change and qualitative change. And when you have qualitatively new productive forces, and these importantly are not just new technologies, they're very important, but as has been pointed out by Chinese specialists, also includes a very important contradiction of Chinese culture and civilization. When you have qualitatively new productive forces, it's been indicated clearly by the CPC Central Committee and other studies, there's also needs to see changes in the relations of production. So this is the it's called different things. It's called high quality development, qualitatively new productive forces, and the changes in relations of production. From my understanding, this is a huge sort of process of transition that's underway currently, and the results will become clear down the track.
Oh, may I ask you to elaborate, or at least give a concrete example when you say qualitatively different, qualitative productive forces, qualitatively.
Okay, qualitatively new productive forces. So, I mean, you still need, look, at economic level, you need to make things. This is reality. You need to make things. But the processes of making things are being transformed, thoroughly transformed. I'll give you an example. There was a survey done between German industries and Chinese industries. as to how keen they are to adopt new technologies and see how they work, trial and error. And only 30% of German enterprises were interested in doing this. They wanted to wait and see. But more than 70% of Chinese enterprises were keen to develop them. Now, it's called generically artificial intelligence, but this is a collection of many, many new forms of technology, science and technology. And already from the time of Deng Xiaoping, science and technology are seen as very, very important economic drivers. So it's all of those qualitatively new productive forces, ranging through from I've been to Qingdao commercial port, where everything now in the port, one of the major ports in the world, is automated. That's one small example. I've seen supercomputers and networks across China that deal with all sorts of things. And I've met the director of an enterprise that manufactures quantum computer chips. They're obvious examples, but it's also been emphasized that in order to understand how this works, you also need the contribution of core Chinese values, that culture plays a very, very important role in these qualitatively new productive forces, in all sorts of levels of ways of thinking about the world, of developing and innovating culture in light of the tradition, and so on. So it's a rather wide range and there's a lot of research underway currently related to all of this. I'm not sure if that's particularly clear. Perhaps Professor Gao Jian can make it clearer.
No, no. Actually, yeah. Professor Bowman has pointed out quality of new product forces. This is a very brand new term for China's design of the future economic development in the new era. And but going back to the host question about the private sector's role,
Yeah,
and let me just make a review about evolution of on different stages. Actually, if we look at the original interpretation about what is a socialism country, there's a very, very clear standard. That is, the economy must be purely state owned. That is a very important yardstick, measure to identify whether the society is of socialism or not, in the 19, let's say 19, around 1950s. And I still remember when I was in the middle school, and our teacher just taught us. Now, in 1954, after some social reforms, China converted into a socialism country. Why? Because nearly 99% of the economy, of their property, actually is owned by the state. And that is an important standard. Okay. However, uh, fact is, after 1978, now the reason why, in the traditional idea of socialism, why economy, the property, must be state-owned, because here there's a very strong idea that is, if we permit private-owned, if we permit capital, that means we would allow exploitation and deprivation. This is very important. We would allow exploitation means we would allow poor people to be exploited by the property owned by the capitalists. So this idea was so strong in the early, let's say early stage of socialism practice after 1949. However, after, let's say, 1978, with the opening up policy, the Chinese government have come to realize at the early stage of socialism, of Chinese socialism, we must allow the injection of capital from the world so as to help us to improve our economy, so as to solve the problem of universal poverty at the early stage of socialism of China. And even now, I must point out, even now, the scramble for capital is still a very hot and heated competition between different nations. and China, even India, Australia, or Germany, even Donald Trump, we all realize it's very important for the economic prosperity. We must we must allow and welcome the investment of capital. This is the truth. Let's admit that. So, however, in China, when we talk about private, talk about capital, I must point about the other side of the story, that is state-owned enterprise, that is public section. And for the Chinese economy, one of the most conspicuous characteristic is that the very important key, predominantly important economic sections, actually, for the benefits of all, for the whole nation's benefits, actually, these sections are in the hand of the state-owned enterprises. This is very, very important. Why China's electricity is very cheap? Why China's transportation developed so rapidly? Why China could adopt some state large-scale, projects very smoothly? Because we have the long-time plan, which is at the interest of the national, of the whole people. So that is very important. The reason we could ensure that is because all these economic sections actually are absolutely in the hand of the public, in the hand of the state, in the hand of, let's say, in the hand of CPC on behalf of the Chinese people, for the people's benefits. So, in the future, I would like to say, even in the future, I think the combination of private owned sectors and the public owned, state owned sectors would be coexistent in Chinese economy. And I think they are complementary with each other. They are in serving for different purposes. And yes, this is a very conspicuous characteristic of Chinese socialism. And some people would say, well, Chinese socialism is not Chinese socialism, but Chinese capitalism. I myself absolutely disagree with this idea. The reason, again, it is necessary. It is not realistic if we reject the flow in of capital. However, it is important to use the power of capital in service for the founding of socialism society. This is our rule. Yeah.
Yes, I agree 100%. I agree 100% with what Professor Gao Jian has said. Sometimes, if I'm asked this question, young Chinese people, I like to ask a foreigner this question: Is China on the capitalist road or the socialist road? And my answer is, if China had gone on the capitalist road in 1978, China would not have developed to the point where it is today. That's only possible if you follow the socialist road. The second point is, ultimately, it's a very, very simple question. What is the purpose? What is the purpose of combining a planned and a market economy, of combining the core and main economic driver of state-owned enterprises and non-public enterprises? The purpose is the public good, the construction of socialism. That's a crucial point. And maybe I can go back to my early example of this non-public enterprise in Hangzhou called Hailiang. It's a non-public enterprise, very large, very important. And its founder, still, he's a Buddhist, and so on. It has two purposes. One is the economic bottom line, but by far the most important is social responsibility. And there are almost 3,000 party members in this non-public enterprise who are involved in all levels of the enterprise. It's known as a red non-public enterprise, put it that way. And so what you find is the combination with what we can loosely call private, or I prefer non-public, is that increasingly they align with the overall project, driven by the state-owned enterprises. And last point, I like to say this to people who have been indoctrinated with the idea that state-owned enterprises are inefficient, cannot do things quickly, bureaucratic, and so on. I say if you reform them and keep them efficient, state-owned enterprises have been shown in China to be the drivers of innovation, efficiency, comprehensive development, and long-term planning, and that they are the way forward.
That's
Absolutely.
very nice. That's very nice to know.
They are.
Uh,
They're much more efficient, run much more cheaply, better at innovating, better at planning, better at implementation. No question.
coming back to technology again, one very brief intervention or question. In India, left usually has ambiguous relationship with technology, because technology is obviously good. It means, the development of productive forces, a better possibility of better living standards and everything. So, and technology may bring with it new kind of utilities, new kind of products. But technology also often, when it's in the control of capital, when it's at the service of capital, it brings unemployment, at least for a brief period or even sometimes prolonged period of time. And because in China has market, China has private capital, and some of these problems may exist there also. So I wonder how the state deals with it. Does it have, because you said, Chinese capital functions in a different way because of the strong state and the strong state owned enterprises. So is there any way that this, how China handles this contradiction of technology?
It's a common question, and often it boils down to, with all of the new technologies, what are the implications for employment? The kinds of work that people do, some kinds of work will no longer be done by human beings. What happens to people? And this question goes back to waves of industrialization earlier. And what happens here is that work never disappears, but the nature of work changes. The nature of work changes. So, for example, on a commercial port for the loading and unloading of ships, 100 years ago or even less, it was required a lot of people who physically handle the goods. Now it requires very, very few people who are basically sitting controlling the computers that make all of these things happen. So if there's a change in the type of work, the crucial task for all sorts of agencies, government agencies and others, is to ensure that people are retrained in time for the new types of work. That's a crucial thing, because otherwise you do end up with an unemployment problem, especially for people in their 40s and 50s. So that's my own perspective on this, but it is a very common question. What happens to people who lose their jobs because they're taken over by new types of technology?
Well, I absolutely agree with Professor Bourne. This is a universal problem. And let's say two response I'm going to make. First, the advent of technology. On the first appearance, the advent of machine is highly related to what kind of form of labor, what kind of let's say social productive relationship. And at a very early time, the first group of workers, uh, they 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 take machine as a kind of substitute of their job opportunity. So they
Mm,
smashed machines. But however, machine was rampant and it developed very highly in the past centuries. The high technology by nature is the advanced expression, is the advanced form of the previous machine. They take the same function but on different stages. This is my first principle, my first
mm,
conclusion.
correct.
And the reason is driven now in the capitalism society. Technology, the development of technology is driven by the pursuit of the maximum of capitalism. Now, for the benefits. and to improve the working efficiency so as to earn advantageous competitive position in the social competition. So in this sense, I think for the capitalism society, the advent of high technology would be a very huge social problem. Now we can see in the Western, in American society, from Silicon Valley, some very representative thinkers and even practitioners like Elon Musk, these leading, very smart people. We call them bureau technology, bureau tech, right? And these people actually they are calling for to making American society under the leadership of these tech bureaus because they think most of the people would be useless in the future. You know, in their projection of the future society, um, most of the people would be replaced by robots. So this is their imagination of the future society. However, I personally disagree with that. If there would be that kind of possibility, there will be revolution in their society. Let's see. Okay. But going back to China, yes, we are also facing to some degree the same problem with the development of high technology so as to eliminate some jobs. However, you know, once there's a problem, there would be a solution to that.
Mm.
If we have our government who are at the interest of the whole nation, at the interest of the whole people. So, you know, that is my conclusion. What I mean say that is that, you know, that is the reason why we should have the government. Because if the government is at the interest of the whole people, the government would realize their ultimate mission is to make a well balanced society and to respond to the people to the public's requests and their benefits. So how to make that, let's see. But I want to say this is not a theoretical question. I mean, this is we cannot answer theoretically. I think in the future practice we would provide a solution to that. Anyway, the ultimate principle is the advent or the development of high technology must be in service for the people instead of in replacement of the people. This is my absolutely well self confirmed idea with the future of technology. I believe in that.
That's a very, very good point. I think I'd like to add to this a question that was asked by a very high level brain surgeon, because, you know, particularly in medicine, in surgical procedures and medical diagnostics, technology is rapidly developing. And the surgeon was asked, do you think there'll be a time when we won't need doctors or surgeons anymore? That all of this can be done by, you know, high-tech machines, artificial intelligence? And the surgeon said, absolutely not. Why? He said, medicine is all about understanding the person. The technique is very, very important, yes. And with technology, the techniques improve. But understanding a person is understanding a person's feelings, emotions, judgment, and so on. And a human being is so complicated that dimension of the spiritual dimension of a human life, the warm dimension of human existence, all those sorts of things, a machine will never be able to replicate. And in my area of work, in study of philosophy, it's a question of studying a question, thinking about a question, and a question of judgment in light of experience, in light of discussions with colleagues, and so on. And it's that kind of measured judgment that is part of the way in which I engage with things, that even the most high tech machinery that we can't even imagine now will never be able to replicate those aspects of human existence. So, in that respect, on top of this, what's the purpose or the service of the people and so on, there's also an element here about human existence for which these tools can be an assistance and in our service or can be seen as our enemy. And I think the first one is far better.
I
Thank you.
agree. I agree. Absolutely.
I have one last question to ask. It relates to global South. Briefly, how does Chinese Communist Party, and how do Chinese people and intelligentsia view China's relationship with global South, both the political and economic relationship? For example, how do they view Palestine, and how far are they willing to go in support of such oppressed people and in politically? And when it comes to economic relationships, we hear this concept of common prosperity, the trade relationships and belt and road. And how does how far, because when you say trade, after all, I think even with global South on the net, China has a surplus. And when trade surplus comes into play, it also means you export capital. And in the long term, how does China view this? Chinese intelligence, how do they view this? Is it a, de- its desirability of exporting capital in the long term?
I think I'll let my good friend Gao Jian start with this one.
Well, the first, China's relationship with the global south has been clearly expressed by the government. Actually, China is a member of the global south. As a representative country of the global south, China has its unique characteristics and definitely is a powerful member of the global south, which is true. And a you know, as for the international development, well, Belt and Road Initiative was initiated by Chinese government. However, it was enjoyed by the universal participation of different members. And I disagree. Now, let's say I know that for a certain period of time, and probably even now, Belt and Road Initiative is regarded or interpreted as a kind of China's, let's say, some people they use the term new colonialism or China's dream of building up of like a imperial society or kind of that. And or there's a term that China's version of Marshall Plan, something like that. But if we look at what we commonly have achieved with the joint efforts between China and some other and all the countries involved in or engaged in Belt and Road Initiative. Now, a lot of statistics or figures have showed up. Belt and Road Initiative bring a lot of very enormous benefits for the local development of economy and created a lot of job opportunities. And China definitely now China must invest and must benefit. China is not God, to be honest. Okay, China is not the country who would say, well, we would sacrifice everything for the common benefits of all the other nations. I don't think if we take China as such a nation, I think we ask too much from China. Okay,
Mm.
however, uh, for the high quality Belt and Road Initiative, how and let's say co-building up initiative, I would like to say that China as a nation would take a common interest and a common prosperity, a shared community as the guiding principles for the projects China is going to put forward. And I can safely say, although there would be some discussion about China's initiative or motivation. However, I would fairly say that China would never be like a new colonizer in the global south countries. The reason is obvious. China was once colonized in the 19th century and the early period of 20th century. And China and the Chinese people have a more than full understanding of the bitter experience of being colonized. And it is absolutely against the Chinese culture principle to exploit the other nations and by means of colonizing or to impose China's value upon the other nations or by means of coercive means. No, it is not. To be honest, China has been a very comprehensively powerful nation now, not only materialistically, but also, militarily, to be honest. And however, let's see what happened in South China Sea. Even now, South China Sea is in conflict now. However, even in face of the challenge, even in face of the confrontational attitude from Philippines, you know, by comparison, by contrast, we know Philippines is such a tiny power in comparison with China. But what China does is to try to make the compromise with all the participants with the Philippines because we think there must be a middle way. There must be a neutral means. There must be, let's say, a way that we could find out for the benefits of both interests. So, in the future, I think this is the principle of neutrality comes from Chinese traditional value. You know, never go to extremes. Try to find some common interest and put aside or leave aside the disparities. Now, this is the principle China will stick to in the future, now and in the future, in relationship with the other nations. Yeah.
Maybe a small footnote to that. Sometimes, a lot of these accusations. Where's my? It's gone to the other camera. Okay. I'll just add something. These accusations often come from Western sources and sometimes appear elsewhere about the Belt and Road Initiative or the Global Security Initiative, the Global Civilization Initiative, the Global Civilization Initiative. And I think there's a good saying that applies here. I think it comes from Denmark initially. A thief always thinks everyone else is a thief. Now, what do I mean by that? So the sort of Western model of modernization, of imperialism and colonialism, they think that everybody else wants to do the same thing. They think that everyone else is a thief and can't understand when they're engaging with someone who's not a thief in all of that. So I think that's a good way of looking at things like the Belt and Road. Maybe one other perspective. I recently worked on an article on one of the journals I'm involved in, and it was a very interesting argument which was using a Marxist framework for understanding the four initiatives. Initially, the Belt and Road Initiative, and then the Global Civilization Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, and so on. And the argument made there was that from a Marxist perspective, the Belt and Road Initiative is focused on the economic base. This is obviously very, very important. It's a foundation of so many other things, but it's not the end of the story, and that the subsequent initiatives are actually coordinated with that, and that they can be seen, if you like, as part of I think the other one's Global Governance Initiative. They can be seen as part of the superstructure for a way in which an international project actually has an overall Marxist framework to it. And they're interconnected, and this is how they work.
No, I
So it's an
totally
interesting
agree.
perspective. I'm rather persuaded by that.
Often people in the global south some in the left in the global south always look for somebody else to come and save them, and sometimes they often think that China will come and save them. But I think the emergence of China gives a lot of space for the left and gives a lot of space for progressive movements. The fact that there is that US has weakened due to the emergence of China, that there is this alternative power that does not use coercive operators, that does not have that kind of coercive intentions to global south, that itself provides a lot of space for global south countries. Now I think it's up to them to make use of that for their own development, as you said, according to their historical and social conditions. That applies to India as well. I mean, we have seen recently the emergence of deep seek AI, and the increase of solar power in the global south countries based on the purchases, solar power panel purchases from China. So I do see we do see a lot of advantages in China's emergence for global south. So that we have to say.
And I also hope that India, in all its complexity, can move to a status of healthy competition with China.
Yeah, I think India is, I think,
Healthy
figuring
competition.
out right now. So go back by a step and then go forward a step.
Yeah,
We have to see how it pans forward.
yeah. Two very ancient civilizations with much to contribute to the
Yeah, we
world.
have much to
That's
lose.
for
Both of
sure.
us have much to lose with any existence of antagonisms, and much to gain when we go on a balanced relationship.
Yeah. Actually, what I really
Yeah.
appreciate it is we had two rounds of cultural exchange communication between President Xi and Modi. I mean, I think it is before the pandemic period. First is in Wuhan. The second time is in India. And forget the city. It's a very ancient culture city, and it will every time it will last 2 days. So the two leaders would have communication for 2 whole days, and sometimes they have discussion on politics. Sometimes they would visit some cultural heritages. So I think it's really fantastic, and I would like to say now personally, I have a very strong admiration of Indian culture because as a philosopher, I fully understand the importance of Indian wisdom, Indians' interpretation of life value. And but sometimes, I even cannot, how to describe it. Um, anyway, both countries we need more channels for communication. We need more no channels for deeper, more thorough communication with each other. And some nationalists on the websites from both sides are they are ignorant of the importance of our bilateral relations because we together we occupies nearly one third of the whole world population. And India, definitely, no matter how many social problems you are facing now, but India is a full potential country now and in the future. And actually, India's films, in my childhood, India's films was very popular at that time. And then now quite a few India films are very popular on Chinese screen. And if, for example, there's a Let's Grapple Father, right? Let's Riso. How Riso? That Father, let's Riso. 摔跤.
Yes, yes. There's
Yes,
been a
right,
movie.
yeah. My daughter loved the film very much. She watched it 5 times
Mm.
when she was at her 8 years. I don't know why, but she liked the film very much. It's a story of a daughter. So I think she cast herself into the role. The two girls were encouraged by their father. So that's a very encouraging story. And so we both country. I would highly appreciate. I would actively participate in the future if your organization to just to build up some channels for our further communication. I would be very happy to participate. Yes.
Right now, I think India's one of
Well, I
top
think also if
ministers
we
right
go,
now. I think is touring
sorry,
China. So I think the dialogue is on, and hopefully it will get better.
continue. Well, the story goes way back while we're talking about cultural exchange, of course. One of the great, great stories of the Chinese tradition, one of the great four, is, of course, called Journey to the West, set in the time of the Tang Dynasty, where four different characters, the Monkey King is now the most famous one, but it's actually a Buddhist priest in time of the Tang Dynasty who was sent to the West, which is what we now know as India, for a copy of the Buddhist scriptures. And so, this connection goes back hundreds of years, 1,000 years or more goes back. So it's certainly a long one. And let's hope the future it improves. There's
Yes,
more
I hope
opportunity.
maybe soon we can talk about India-China relationship. Yes.
I would be very happy to
Mm.
participate. Although I'm not an expert in this respect, but for a certain period of time, I do very much keen on what happened in our relationship, and I would be very happy to see a promising future. Very genuinely, yeah.
Thank you, Professor Baur, Professor Gao. Great insights. It has been a wonderful conversation.
Same here. I am very, very interested in it. There is much I need to learn about India, but perhaps I can just say that in my undergraduate degree, I studied classical languages. Now, two of them were, of course, classical Greek and classical Latin,
Oh,
but I also studied Sanskrit. So we studied the Rig Veda, Bhagavad Gita, etc., etc., etc. So it's a long time ago. It was when I was
you
an
should say one
undergraduate
line for
student,
us,
but
Professor Baur.
oh, look, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm 64 this year, and I think I started university when I was
A long
18.
time ago. Yeah, yeah.
It's a long time ago, I'm afraid.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate your coming and giving this time, valuable
Yeah.
time.
Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated with the latest incidents. Hit the bell icon to never miss an update. We will see you next time with more news that matters. Stay informed, stay safe.